Hello. So I've as I've been looking through the videos I've been uploading in the last few years, quite a number of them have been about China. And if I'm being honest, they have taken a more negative angle, or a more critical angle, let's say. Now, I want to make this video in order to balance things out a little bit. And it's not that I necessarily take back anything that I've said in those videos. I'm an honest person, so the things that I've said I would probably stand by, because it's how I was feeling at the time when I made them. Um, but I do feel that perhaps it may give the impression that I'm just anti-China, and I'm really not. I'm not making this to please anyone. I just feel that it is important to show the whole picture of who I am and what my perspective is. So in this video, I want to talk about many things that I like about China. I've been in the country, by the way, so I'm speaking on some level from first-hand experience. So I'll try and lay out some of those things here, and feel free to ask any questions if you want about this video. Firstly, in terms of hospitality, that's something that when I was there I found to be quite widespread, especially among young people. By the way, I should give you the background. I was an English teacher in a Chinese high school for 6 months. I also spent time in a summer camp and done some private tutorial work. So basically I was an English teacher in China, which is relatively common. China is one of the best countries, by the way, to go if you are an English teacher. Incidentally, I should say, I've promoted myself in the group that I went through, which was Buckland Education, and I would reevaluate that now, or re-emphasize that now. Buckland as an organisation, if you're an English teacher and you're sort of wanting to teach in China, but you're not sure where to start, through Buckland you won't get the best pay, but you will certainly get security, and you will get exactly as it says on the tin, as we would say in the UK. They are a very reputable company. Doesn't mean things will go perfectly. I mean, I think going to any other country you need to expect some hiccups, but as an organisation they are trustworthy, and they basically do everything that they say they will do. They get someone to meet you at the airport, and the staff there are fantastic. They really go out of their way to welcome people, to help you settle in, because obviously if you're coming from the other side of the world it is nice to have someone sort of make you feel welcome, and they really go out of their way to do that. So my first sort of impression of hospitality in China was a very good one, because I had a problem at the airport. The case had been lost, which is something that often happens, and they sorted that all out immediately, and I got the case back the next day. Luckily nothing was damaged. I find young Chinese especially, and by young I mean sort of teenagers and people in their early 20s, university level, are genuinely hospitable people. It's not a face thing, which is something in Chinese culture. I think it's a sincere thing. They genuinely want to give a good impression of their country, so they do try to be civil, welcoming to people coming from around the world. And personally I'm deeply grateful actually for a lot of the help that I got. Without that help, maybe I would have worked things out eventually, but certainly it saved a lot of stress. To give some examples, I mean, a lot of people I already knew were friends from who had studied in the West, and I already knew them, so I had that advantage of already having connections with a lot of Chinese people. But there were situations, for example, when I would miss my last train, and then I would panic and phone up a friend, and she came to sort everything out. There was other situations when the school bike got a puncture, so the students showed me where to bring it. In many cases actually Chinese students have much better English than their Chinese teachers, and that's not meant as disrespectful to the teachers, it's just the reality. So they are, if you're an English teacher, they're a great point of contact, and they will go out of their way to help. I find a lot of them actually quite enjoy doing it. They find that it gives them a purpose, it gives them a chance to get out of the stuffy classroom for a while. I'm talking about during the lunch break. It's just something different, and it's from a foreigner's perspective it is incredibly welcoming, because most English teachers honestly don't have a very high fluency in Chinese. Mine is 一点点中文, which basically means limited Chinese. I can say basic things, I can get by, but my Chinese is not wonderful. I have a long way to go. So the help I got from students was priceless, actually, and to this day I'm grateful for it. Like I said, I may have worked things out eventually myself, but they really are very helpful. So if you're in trouble in China, I would say young people are very trustworthy. It's not that old people aren't, but there is a level maybe of more, there is a bit more of a gulf with older people, I find. Not everyone, but it is quite an obvious gap. And just young people tend to be a little bit more plucky when it comes to speaking to foreigners, and a bit more, you definitely notice it. They tend to be very helpful, and I would say go with them. So what else do I like? You can't get bored in China. Even if you're in a smaller city, just the fact of being in another country, in another culture, I think you'd be a pretty narrow-minded person if you got bored easily in a country like China. Even in smaller cities where there isn't necessarily a huge deal of attractions, just taking it in. I mean, I would say that not just about China, but any other country, that if you're not familiar with it, by essence it is different, it is interesting. And if, like me, you enjoy taking pictures, China is a great country for photography, and actually it's very liberal in this regard. You can take pictures of almost anything. The Chinese are very laid back about that, and it's I took, no exaggerating, somewhere in the region of 6,000 photos when I was there. Sorry, please excuse me 1 second. I have left a candle burning, and health and safety. Gonna roll out. Thank you. So you really can't get bored over there. I mean, one thing I find too is, from a Western perspective, it's so affordable. So many things are just like for nothing. You can get a bus fare for somewhere in the region of 10 pence. If you're a smoker, you can get cigarettes for 30 pence. You can get an evening meal in a provincial smaller city for the equivalent of £1, which is 10 RMB. So really, you will find that if you can save a lot of money in China. Of course, your wages would be in relation to the Chinese standard wages for a teacher, but it's actually quite well paid, and there is a big demand for English teachers. So you'll find that you're probably wealthier as a teacher in China than you would be in a Western country. So proportionally speaking, when you do the translation, it may not seem like much, but bear in mind China is still a developing country, and things are a lot more affordable there. So you'll find, I mean, I'm not saying it's universal. In bigger cities, you would find things a bit more expensive, and you wouldn't see a huge difference in the bigger cities. But in small Chinese cities, you'll find that you're living pretty comfortably. You can save quite a lot of money if you're pragmatic, and if you're not reckless and go out every night, then you'll find that it's actually pretty financially efficient in that sense. Even if you are paid less than some other companies, like Buckland doesn't pay the best, but you get the security with it. And as a teacher, you can be paid a lot out there. So that's one of the good things about China, the fact there is all these opportunities for English teachers. Another thing, as a Westerner, I've mentioned in other videos that there is a sort of there is a closed, defensive attitude there, and that's true, but that is balanced out by a genuine curiosity that makes you end up feeling almost like a rock star. And I'm not exaggerating. If you are one of the very few Westerners in a small Chinese city, you will feel like a minor celebrity. You will literally have teenage girls coming up and asking for pictures with you. And believe me, that is it's quite amusing, and it's quite a nice feeling actually, unless you're a very shy introvert person, in which case, in my view, teaching shouldn't be for you. But to go to a country like China, you need to be an open, confident person, otherwise it's going to be a problem. But in that sense, it is very, I mean, it might sound a bit vain on my part, but it is actually quite enjoyable. getting that sort of focus and attention, because it makes you feel like you're valued, that your work is valued, that you're valued almost as a person, and it's quite a cool feeling actually. It's quite amusing, but it's quite cool as well, and it's understandable because in many cases there are so few Westerners there that we are a novelty, so you can't blame them for being curious. Um, what else? Food. You can never get bored with Chinese food because there is a huge variation. Now, I have to say it's not quite like Chinese food that you would expect to get in Chinese restaurants in the West, or in Britain, for example, which is typically sweet and sour Cantonese style. That would not be the standard food in China. But then again, China doesn't really have standard food because there's so much variation. So, unless you're an extremely picky person, or unless you're a vegetarian or you've got allergies, then you can't really get bored with Chinese cuisine. There's so much on offer. Some of it is a little tricky to eat because it's on the bone. There's a lot of meat on the bone. That could be a bit awkward to get around, but there's huge variation, especially from province to province, and some of it has great taste. I also think actually it's pretty healthy because you get it directly from the source at times. There has been a few scandals, health scandals concerning Chinese food over the years, but having said that, if you go to a good stall and you know, I never had problem with street food, and I always found it very tasty, very rich taste, very filling. So you can't go wrong with it, and it's very affordable. You might obviously want to check the ingredients sometimes, because in some parts of the country there are things that we in the West would consider a bit taboo. History and culture. Well, China is one of the world's great civilizations. It goes back, if you go back to the legendary Xia dynasty, up to 5,000 years ago. Even historical records go back 4,000 years. That's similar to Egypt in terms of longevity of history. So it is one of the world's great civilizations, and the great thing about China is, despite all its history of warfare and everything it's been through, there's actually quite a lot that is still preserved. And I believe they're now protected sites, and that's a great thing. As you can see, some just off the top of my head that I would recommend is the Yellow Crane Tower in Wuhan. I'm using the English names. That's a big historic pagoda. Amazing building. The Great Wall, of course, is famous, but I haven't personally been there. There's no shortage of temples, and they do differ actually in architecture and style depending on the exact denomination and period of history. But even smaller cities, you'll have at least several landmarks, not necessarily famous around the country, but still worth visiting. Beauty, natural beauty. This is not universal. There's parts of the country that are basically under construction. There's new cities and so on, which, I'm being completely honest, are not scenic. But that is balanced out with some astonishing beauty. One of the most beautiful places I have seen in my life, possibly the number one, is in Guangxi region. It's classed as a region as opposed to a province, but the landscape there is astonishing. The locals, I guess, are used to it, but it really is like something from Avatar. If you've seen the film Avatar, it's like Pandora. It is so beautiful, so captivating, just stunning. And a lot of the sort of landscape around there is what I would call postcard China. When you see in Chinese restaurants here, you see sort of these mountain scenes and poetry, and it's a postcard China, and it is stunningly beautiful. And there's a timelessness to that which is very... I mean, I'm a sentimental person. I find that quite moving to think how old this country's history is and to sort of reflect on that, and it's quite a thought. What else can I say about China? Diversity among the provinces. You'll find there's actually quite a big difference culturally speaking from province to province. Some are more similar than others, but there is definitely, for example, in some areas there's a higher concentration of ethnic minorities, especially in places like Yunnan and Guangxi. In Guangxi, for example, there's a large concentration of Zhuang people and Miao people. and you get these pockets of minorities, and quite often, not always, but often they will retain a lot of their traditional culture. In fact, I'll show you something that reminds me. A friend gave me this, and it's basically a calendar, but it's a very colourful, very beautiful calendar, and each page is a different group. It's not all of them, because there's 56, and obviously this is 12 months, but each one shows a different group. November, that's Dong people. This month, August, is Mongolian people. The biggest is Han. This one is Uyghur. So there's all sorts of groups here, and some of them have really beautiful outfits. Not just the women, the men as well have very colourful outfits, and some of them have their own traditions. I think it's the Dong people, but don't quote me on that. There's a small city in northeast Guangxi region called Longcheng, which is famous for rice terraces, and there you can see local women whose hair is so long that they tie it up, they wrap it up, and that's quite a sight. It's quite amazing seeing those sort of traditions. You have to be a little careful. Some of it can be a bit of a tourist trap if they kind of focus on that, but I mean, you don't necessarily have to go to any landmark or festival to see that sort of tradition. Sometimes you'll just see those people choosing to wear their own traditional dress, and you'll see them around the place. Some of them have integrated into mainstream sort of culture, so they haven't necessarily retained that. I've got friends from minority groups, and they just dress like normal modern people, so it's not always there, but that diversity actually within China is very strong. And it's not necessarily multiculturalism in the Western sense, but it is very diverse. Diversity is the word I would use. And the difference between the provinces can perhaps be compared to the differences between American states. Obviously in China, the federal government has quite a lot of power, but the diversity is fascinating, and it does mean that you can go from one province to another and never get bored. So in that sense, it's an amazing country, and I only saw actually a relatively small part. Thinking about it, I only really saw the southeast and a bit of the centre. I wasn't in the west, I wasn't in the north, I wasn't in the north centre, I wasn't very much in the east, with the exception of Shanghai. That brings me on to the next point. Shanghai, world-class city. I can't comment much about Beijing because I haven't been there, but I suspect it's also a great place. But Shanghai is just breathtaking. It's futuristic, and yet there's history there. It's clean, it's vibrant, it's proud, it's confident, it's aesthetic. It's just an amazing place. It's one of my favourite world cities. Even though I lost money there, I had no bad feelings. I didn't have any bitterness because I was just so captivated by the place. I love it. I love Shanghai. Another Chinese city I would strongly recommend is Changsha, which is very clean actually. It's got a lot of parks. It's a very green city. Got a lot of history. There's something there called Yelushan Mountain. There's a big statue of Mao at the bottom, so you won't miss this landmark. But that's some stunning beauty. Again, I pointed out the beauty of China. This is an example of that. I mean, sometimes there's a stereotype about China with pollution and building projects, and that side does exist. I won't deny it, but China is such a huge country that it can never be stereotyped in one particular way. And that actually also applies to Chinese people. That's why I'm always very, very reluctant to say a typical Chinese person, because really that's a very misleading term. I can honestly say, apart from British people, because I am British, I have been in contact overwhelmingly with Chinese people over the past 4 or 5 years. I've known them more than any other national group of people, so I feel I know Chinese people relatively well, and even I am always forever finding different characters, different personalities, and of course that's true of any nationality, but when you have 1.4 billion people, it's especially true. So you just can't generalize the Chinese. In other words, the point why I'm including this as a good thing is that if you have a bad experience with a Chinese person, you can rest assured it is not a trend. It is not something that is going to be universal. So for everyone you may have had a bad experience with, there will be someone else who is very, very nice. And some of the nicest, most generous, people I've met in my life have been Chinese. And I'm not just saying that. It's the absolute truth that some of the most gregarious people I've met have been Chinese. There's been times I've been very down, and it's been Chinese friends who have made me feel better. So I'm very grateful to them, and I've tried to reciprocate. What else can I say? Young Chinese people aren't so interested in it, but I find traditional Chinese music to be so relaxing, so just very powerful. It really, I find it very moving. And I can't specify any songs or any particular instruments, although one I would quote is erhu, which is a sort of wind instrument. But if you just type in traditional Chinese music to YouTube, you'll get a wide range of videos. Check any of those out. They're just stunningly beautiful, and you could just, if you're a sentimental person, you can sort of reflect on that, and it's just really amazing. Another thing I like is some aspects of the Chinese film industry. What I mean by that is you get some period epics which are spectacular, especially Zhang Yimou. In Chinese society there's mixed opinions about him, but personally I think the guy is a genius. I think he has a real ability to captivate viewers. I mean, the choreography of his films, I'm not talking about historical accuracy or anything here, I'm talking solely from an aesthetic perspective. Incredible. I mean, it's so, an example would be Curse of the Golden Flower, which wasn't even that popular in China, but it's an amazing film. So China has got a thriving film industry. I think I've exhausted everything I want to say now. If I think of anything else, I'll put it in annotations. But basically, China is a fascinating country, and whilst I would stand by all the critical points I've made, I also want to make it clear that I mean, I'll show you something just to emphasize my point. You might be able to see this Chinese flag. Behind that, I've got a British flag and an American flag. If I'm being honest, they're probably the three countries that I've had that I am most, if you like, sentimental about. The British flag, naturally, because I am British. Chinese flag, because whilst I'll always be a Westerner, whilst I will always be British in my identity and my thinking, China, I think, will always have a special place for me, despite all the frustrations I sometimes have with things that go on there or certain situations there. China is a special country for me, and I would go as far as to say I do love China. Sincerely, I do love it. Don't love everything about it, but I love China. And I always say that countries are always bigger than any particular thing going on within them. The United States is there as well, because it's a world superpower, and I've been there, and I don't know, I think the US is a great country as well. So yeah, those three flags are sort of, I guess, the countries, and that's no slight on anyone else, by the way. It's I'm an open-minded person. I like many countries. Those three countries happen to have a particular resonance with me. Isn't much more to say, really. Sure, I can think of something, but yeah, I think that'll do for now. There is a lot I like about China, and that's why I do want to go back as soon as I can. It's a great country. I mean, if you get an opportunity once in your life to do it, I would say just go for it. I mean, it's a huge country. It's the world's most populous country. There's so much to see, and it's almost a cliche to talk about, oh, China's amazing these days, but it really is. I mean, it's a spectacular place, and I recommend going there if you have at least one opportunity in your life. Okay, thank you for watching.